All right, good morning. Greetings from Washington, D.C. in the United States. My name is Terrence Ham. I am the Associate Vice President for Communications and Marketing at the Council for Opportunity and Education. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our webinar, Designing Tertiary Education Experiences in Light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Really appreciate you for joining. Just a couple of notes about tech. All participants have been placed in listen-only mode. Please submit your questions to our panelists and our presenters via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom console. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Council for Opportunity and Education's YouTube page after the session ends. With that, I'll kick it over to our lovely panelists and presenters today. Thank you all so much for joining us again. Catherine.
Thank you, Terrence. Welcome to the Designing Tertiary Education Experiences in Light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. What if equity, access, diversity, and inclusion for students, educators, and staff were the new normal webinar? I'm Catherine Millett, and I'm socially isolating in Princeton, New Jersey in the United States. I chair the executive committee of the Global Access to Postsecondary Education, or GAPS. We are based in The Hague in the Netherlands. I want to thank ECHO in the Netherlands and the Council for Opportunity in Education in the United States for co-convening this webinar with us. And thank you too for choosing to spend your time with us today for this important conversation. Next slide, please. For those of you who are on social media, actually we'll go, yep. I want to share our hashtag today is GAPSEDU. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So we hope that, again, those of you who are social media people will spread the word about the event and some of the commentary and observations that we have today. Next slide, please. So we think a lot about the United Nations and the work that they are doing. And so the United Nations launched in the 2020 decade by ushering in the decade of ambitious action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The decade of action calls for accelerating sustainable solutions to all the world's biggest challenges, ranging from poverty and gender to climate change, inequality, and closing the finance gap. We at GAPS contend that education plays a significant role in achieving the 17 goals along with the 169 targets. And this is one reason why we believe it's important to have voices from colleagues and students and educators from all parts of the world. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may be learning about GAPS for the first time, or those of you who are longtime standing friends of us, GAPS mission is preparing learners for access to, enrollment in, and completion of quality post-secondary education at institutions that value and engage fully in inclusive education and global learning and social responsibilities. And I should underscore that this is all learners. Learners at the different types of educational institutions, of all ages, of all backgrounds. And I think now more than ever, learning is going to be a lifelong journey. And so we want to make sure that we are always opening the doors to education for all people. Next slide, please. We also promote work that recognizes that it's not just access, that students need to get to, through, and beyond college. It's an empty promise if we only bring them in the doors of our institutions, but don't help them journey through them and exit them on to graduate and first professional education and/or employment. Next slide, please. So our foundational tenets are these. The tertiary education, as I said, needs to connect with other parts of the education pathways. Primary education, secondary, and post-bachelor's level education, as well as the market. We can no longer be, and should not be, an island unto ourselves. We also appreciate and recognize that students learn in curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular spaces, and that our work needs to encompass all of the uniquenesses of these areas and the connections that can be made across them. We also advocate that intersectionality should be appreciated and diversive stereotypes avoided, and I believe our panelists today will share much more about their thoughts on this. And finally, we believe that multiple stakeholders need to engage. So we have welcomed individuals who are in the classroom, who work in policy, who are researchers, who work in community organizations. We all need to be working on these issues together. And so we welcome all of you to bring in your different experiences, perspectives, and thoughts. Next slide, please. So this is a visualization that represents, as I said, our three foci, and we hope that they convey that we see the connection across these. That learners, as we've said, need to prepare for access to, enrollment in, and completion of post-secondary education. The post-secondary education that we see and believe should be an experience for all learners is one that values and engages in inclusive education. And the third tenet is that post-secondary education should value and engage in global learning. Next slide, please. So GAPS launched in 2011, and to date we have convened 6 in-person activities. We've been in Canada, Malaysia, the Netherlands, Brazil, and South Africa. Our approach is to convene in-person events in different areas of the world and partner with local educational organizations. We want to lead with our colleagues at the in-country organization or college and university, sharing with us what the top topics are and challenges in their daily lives in education. But COVID-19 has led us to launch our first webinar. And we're delighted again that you are with us today. So in developing today's program, designing tertiary education experiences in light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, what if equity, access, diversity, and inclusion for students, educators, and staff were the new normal? We decided to start with a student voice. In our opinion, students are the experts when it comes to their education and their ideas about the future. I am grateful that Pravini Babaram will moderate today's conversation. Pravini is a program manager at ECHO in the Netherlands at the Expertise Center for Diversity Policy. In this role, she facilitates the process of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, which I think is something that we are all doing more of each day. Her work leads us to reflect on mechanisms that lead to exclusion in education and the labor market. And in doing so, Pravini invites participants to engage in conversations on systematic inequality. Pravini, I know this webinar is now in your good hands. Thank you very much, Pravini, for doing the moderating for our webinar.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. Just wanted to make sure that you also finished your presentation and there weren't some final words that you wanted to conclude with. Okay.
Good.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As Catherine has already introduced, we have a great panel of students from around the world. And my hope for today is that we can get a sense of what inequality has looked like before COVID, what that experience has been in different parts of the world, reflect on how that has been impacted during COVID, but obviously also through all the social movements that have gained momentum with Black Lives Matter, and also look forward to what we can take from this conversation moving forward with the experiences and lessons learned from the COVID era, and see how creative solutions might inspire us to make our work more impactful and help us contribute to more inclusion in education. So that is my hope for today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of our panelists. So allow me to introduce them to you. and hear their thoughts and reflections on these topics. So can I start with Shanari Firin from Jamaica? Can you briefly introduce yourself, where you're from, and also what you do, and just to get a sense of the work that you do?
Thank you so much, Pravini. I'm really humbled to be here today to share in the conversation and here, as well as to share my experiences as a student, from Jamaica, and sharing my perspective or the perspective of the Caribbean context. I am first and foremost a big sports person. I believe in student athlete development. I believe in giving them a voice as well as all other students. I've engaged in various research, Times Higher Education blogs on students in higher education, how they navigate the space, and some of the gaps that still exist within our higher education systems. And it is important that as we conversate here today, we conversate with a purpose, because I believe conversation is important, but we also need to ensure that there's a purpose and we make positive change as best possible in a global way, because higher education is dynamic and it is transforming, especially considering the the COVID-19 climate that we're operating in. So I am very passionate about students' voice. I'm very passionate about sharing and hearing experiences from other colleagues all over the world. And as part of my journey, especially my graduate journey, I would have been able to interact and share with many people across the world. And one of the most important things that stands out for me is the fact that we're operating in a global space, and everybody's context is important and everybody's voice is important. And speaking from the perspective of a student, as well as someone who was, who have professional experience in higher education, I believe that it is important that we have these conversations. And Pravini, I'm very happy to be a part of it today and to hear from all, our other panelists and our colleagues as well.
Thank you so much, Shanari. And I also wanted to mention that you're a student at the University of the West Indies, right?
Right, I am in Jamaica.
Thank you. In Jamaica. Thank you so much, Shanari.
Sure.
Maribel Sanchez from the US and a student at Wichita State University. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so first and foremost, thank you to everyone at GAPS and ECHO and COE, especially for inviting me. I love to see some familiar faces. So I had the privilege of actually meeting Mary and Pravini and some others, Holly as well, through a global leadership program I was a part of last year. I can't believe it's been 1 year already. But last summer, I traveled to the Netherlands, learned more about diversity and inclusion in that Dutch context, and was able to share more about diversity and inclusion in the United States context, especially in my own background and identities, being a cisgender Latina woman, first generation student and child of Mexican immigrants. So having all these identities and bringing them to the table is kind of my forte, I guess. It's what I love to do both abroad as well as here on my campus. Like Pravini said, I'm going into my senior year at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas. And I'm really excited to get to know every one of you and your experiences with COVID and these movements and everything in between. I'm really excited to share as well. I have been stuck at home, so it's not like I get to talk to people from all over the world every day lately. So I'm very excited and grateful, and thank you again.
Thank you, Maribel. Up next, can I ask Rutani Monfeli from the University of Venda in South Africa to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Pravin. It's my pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Ruzani Mampieri from South Africa. I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Venda. I'm also excited to participate into this webinar of exploring ways to address the issue of access, diversity, and inclusion in post-secondary education in the light of COVID-19, because COVID-19 presents many challenges to universities and to students at large. So I'm really excited to learn from students from Latin America, Europe, to get a new perspective, to get some intelligent drawing from other people so that we can come up with possible solutions to address some of the challenges that we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritsani. Mateus Gomez from Brazil. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank all of you for the opportunity. I'm Mateus. I'm an undergraduate student of mechanical engineering at the University of Campinas in Brazil. I have a mix of experiences in the professional and academic areas. More recently, I've been getting involved with the diversity issue. Like in Brazil, we are talking to the whole world probably, but in Brazil, I guess most of the people out of the country have a different idea of what Brazil is. And for example, we are 200 million people in Brazil, and more than the half of the population are Black people in Brazil. But most of the people have a different image of the country. We are the greatest population, Black population out of Africa. And that's a reason why diversity is important to us. I truly believe, as other people, that we are not here just to discuss, but to propose. And I truly believe we need to prepare people to be in leading position to fill the gap between like Black people and the positions of power around the world. So universities are have an important role in that.
Thank you, Mateus, and also great to hear that you already have some specific ideas on where you want the conversation to go. So I'm looking forward to hear more about that during this webinar. Finally, I would like to ask Afua Achampong from the UK to introduce yourself.
So hi everyone, I'm Afua from Nottingham Trent University. So today I'm representing Europe, but I live in the UK. I'd like to thank COE, GAPS and ECHO for having me here today. I'm very, very excited. It's very exciting to speak on an international platform. And I think together we can make great change and discuss this really interesting topic. So I studied law at Nottingham Trent University, and I did a year in Washington State studying political science. But in my current role at Nottingham Trent University, I'm Vice President Education. So in my role, I represent 33,500 students on their academia. Whilst in my role, I do a lot of work around policy, representation and research. But for me, over the past 2 years, my core focus has been magnifying the voices of marginalized groups, making sure they have a voice at the institution, making sure they feel a sense of belonging and mattering, and working towards the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda within the UK.
Thank you, Afua. So let me dive into the questions right away because I know you're excited to share. My first question to you is, how did you experience these last few months? Because a lot has been going on, and you know there are a lot of not just the restrictions with COVID, you know that make us self-isolate, but obviously also the images that we've seen that led to major protests, you know, related to Black Lives Matter, which affects us not just personally, but I can imagine also in the professional context because of the work that you do. So could you share some initial reflections on how you have experienced these past few months in relation to COVID and Black Lives Matter? And perhaps I can ask Mateus to start, kick off this reflection.
Yes, of course. I'll try to separate in 2 answers. First, about how it is to live during the quarantine, and it is hard. I'll try to explain how it's happening about education mostly. In Brazil, we have, I believe, 2 main issues to be solved. One is the access to technology. So it is not universal. We have part of the population that definitely have access to the internet and all the devices required in this time. but also a huge part of the population that doesn't have it. So it is an important issue. Another one is the preparation of people. For example, at my university, we have part of the professors and the students that were extremely able to this new period, but also some ones that were not, and not even able to change their minds. So it was another challenge to us. At my university, something really good was to identify the people that possibly could not have the access and try to do some partnerships with companies in order to provide devices and access to internet to all of them. So nowadays we are having classes online, and at least for my university, we are trying to live and to deal with all the things and not positive. There is nothing about positive in that, but just to live. About the Black Lives Matter movement and everything, I usually tell my friends that we have one George Floyd case each 23 minutes in Brazil. So it is really hard to deal with all of that. I believe what happened was terrible, and it at least helped us to have a better conscience about Black lives. And it is important, like we are not trying to overestimate the Black lives, but we are just trying to tell the word Black Lives Matter, and that's all. So in Brazil, we were impacted definitely for that. So we are trying to implement some modifications in law and the treatment of policies in order to reach better life situations to Black people at all.
Thank you, Mateus, for those insights. And before I move on to the other panel members, I would like to ask a follow-up question. When you mentioned that half of the student population didn't have access to technology, right, in this COVID situation, to what extent has that also exposed something about the demographics? Because you mentioned, Black students, or the Black population is an important part of the Brazil population. Have you seen that in terms of access to technology? Did that also affect the Black population disproportionately?
Yes, that's a great question. First thing, we have racial problem in Brazil that is also a social problem. So, for example, I told we are 54% of Brazilian population Black. But when we are talking about the convicts, for example, we are more than 80%. Bottom income population, bottom line of income population, we are 85%, and the upper income population, we are 5%. So that is indeed a problem, a social problem with Black people in Brazil, and that's something we need to solve.
Yeah.
So when we are talking about access to basically Black people in Brazil, access to internet and all the resources we need, that's the problem. We have a social problem that just come up with another problem. So that the answer is yes, we have a racial problem about access in Brazil, and that's why we have social problems regarding the race.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that. And what I think is interesting, what I hear from your story in finding solutions, you did not just rely on the educational system, but you actually reached out to sponsors, and did I hear it right when you said also from the corporate industry to provide those resources? So I think that's an interesting connection, right? To kind of think outside the box and see how other stakeholders in terms of corporate partners can also have the social social responsibility, right, towards education in this context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's something about the pandemic. Maybe it brought some conscience for the corporative
Yeah.
to deliver more in
Yeah.
terms of social.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm really curious to hear what that's like in other contexts. Shanari, can I ask you to share and maybe also ask to what extent you maybe recognize some experiences that Matthias has shared?
Right. I can really relate to what Matthias would have said from the Brazil perspective. Jamaica is a developing country, more so. Well, the Caribbean region is developing, and the pandemic would have brought about mixed feelings, and it has been hard. It's been different, and one of the most important things that came to light would have been the inequities as it regards to the socioeconomic factors, backgrounds that many of our students come from. And for example, in Jamaica, when the pandemic hit and students were told to leave campus, many students who work and study on campus, didn't have any option because that's their only way of financing their higher education and their academic journey. So many of them had to drop out, they had to withdraw because they could not finance, going through the pandemic, staying at home. They don't have the resources, the technological resources, as well as that emotional and psychological support needed. One of the most important things that I realized during the pandemic is that many students use the university space as their safe space. That's the space that they use to express themselves and rely on, various colleagues, other students, or administrators and leaders to get by. And that was a very important thing that I saw during the pandemic. But one of the most important things that stood out was the fact that the conversation, I don't know if I should say it came back up, and it's important that we have these conversations because the Black Lives Matter movement, in Jamaica we might not have overt racism, but there are aspects within our systems that is racist. Our system is driven by the colonial past, and for example our higher education systems, our policies have not changed as rapidly as they ought to be as the global space changes. One of the most important things is that our underrepresented groups or disabled students who are minority groups in higher education within my context, the Jamaican context, were left hanging when the pandemic hit. And many of them didn't know what to do. They didn't have any support. And this showed up the fact that our systems have continued to fail us over the years. And one of the other things that stood out was the fact that many leaders didn't know what to do in higher education. Many of them were plunged into a state of worry and were not quick to adapt to the changing times. And as we go forward, I realized too that there's a stigmatization in regards to, for example, student athletes, because many of the athletes that exist in our space, in higher education, especially from the Jamaican context and the Caribbean context, are still being referred only to as athletes within the space, not students, because they are sometimes, looked upon to be not brilliant academics. And it is important that I speak about this because I've interacted with many student athletes who feel as if they're just in the space to get by. And I also realized that during the pandemic, many coaches, administrators did not know how to react to students like these. When I did a blog on how student athletes were reacting or coping during the pandemic, many of them felt that they were on an emotional roller coaster. And that brought about many emotions for them because they feel as if the system has failed them. But one of the things that we tried to do from a professional perspective was to engage them. We would have to use unconventional ways to engage with our students, reach out to them because our geographic location is very diverse. We have urban and we have rural areas. And the urban areas would have more access to resources as against rural areas. Many of our students would have got lost in the system during the pandemic. And as I reflect, I feel as if over the years, experiencing the space as an undergraduate and graduate student, there are different dimensions to how students operate within higher education. Not all students are the same, and the one-size-fits-all approach will definitely not work going forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Shinari. And so you mentioned you tried out some unconventional ways to reach out to students, and I'm sure a lot of people are very curious to hear what those unconventional ways look like. Can you share something about that?
Of course, definitely. We are used to using, emails, the unconventional telephone calls to students. Not all students would have had access to, internet services, for example, and we had to ensure that we call them, text them, one-on-one conversations beyond typical university hours, beyond the 8 to 5, go beyond those hours to reach out to our students. Because what we found out is that many students were, on a mental roller coaster. They were going through emotional punches. And as a result of that, we had to ensure that's our responsibility. And as a student, I felt that as well, because I would have realized that those students who were not connected with were the ones who either withdrew or, just gave up. And using these unconventional ways means that administrators would have had to go beyond the call of duty, regardless of the fact that we are also going through the pandemic. They had to ensure that all the students that they would have had in their systems are accounted for. And to be very honest with you, Praveen, not all students were really accounted for, but I think it showed the institutions that we work in, as well as the context, that more needs to be done to reach our students, because our students come from different backgrounds and not all students are the same. So it really took, it was very eye-opening from this perspective, because the pandemic would have highlighted so many things. And as a result of this, we cannot use the same traditional ways that we've been using over the years to reach our students.
Yeah, I love that phrase, go beyond the call of duty, because I think that going beyond is indeed what is required or necessary to make our systems more inclusive. If
Definitely.
the default is excluding. So thank you, Shinari, for sharing that.
Okay.
So while Matthias and Shinari were speaking, I saw Rutsani nodding a lot. So I'm very curious, Rutsani, to hear your experience coming from South Africa, what you recognize.
The reason why I was like nodding is because Matthias and Shinari, they've said something that it's relatable to South African context. I've assumed that if we have got someone from Brazil, someone from Jamaica in the panel who have some similar challenges or same problems that we face as the students around the world and students from developing countries. So it's the same in South Africa. So COVID-19 a greatest risk to the most vulnerable group, especially those living in poverty, those with pre-existing conditions like inequality. So they are the ones who are exposed because as the pandemic started, since the pandemic started, universities in South Africa, they came up with solutions. How do we survive with the pandemic? What do we do to save the academic year? So online was an option to say that, okay, we can move to online. Like in Brazil, there are corporates that came to the party to support students with data and everything. So, but in South Africa, the Department of Higher Education in my country try by all means to support the universities, all of them, to say that we are going to pay for the data so that students can be able to access online learning. But another thing is urban and rural, like what Shanari said, that a lot of the challenge in Jamaica. We have got many people who come from rural areas, deep rural areas, who cannot have access to internet because of maybe the network coverage is low. So these are some of the people that won't be able to have access to this kind of education under the new normal. So these are some of the challenges. And another thing that what Shanari said about the one-size-fits-all approach. Because in the beginning, people are saying, okay, we can, to save the academic year, let's all move online to online learning. What about others who don't have access to online learning? What do we do about that marginalized group that don't have access to online learning? That means that whatever that you're doing, it won't be in line with the goal number 4 to seek to ensure equal access to all people, men and women around the world, the UN goal for equality, equal education. So that means that we are leaving other people behind. So these are some of the things that I've observed. And remember, around the world, around 3.6 billion people, they don't have access to internet. And majority of these people are coming from the developing countries. So these are some of the challenges that COVID-19 has presented. But looking at the possible solutions, like going forward, what I think, this was a wake-up call to the government to say that we need to be prepared. So we need to have proper infrastructure, ICT, we need to train our people on digital skills. Because other students, first-year students in my university and other universities in South Africa, in the rural university base, so they don't have access to internet. Some of them, they don't know how to use Microsoft Teams, how to Zoom. So these are some of the challenges to higher education that the South African government and Department of Higher Education, they have noted. And another thing that I think the pandemic, as people are seeking solutions to address the challenges that education was facing under the pandemic, they were coming up with many approaches, and some of these approaches have got and they bring unequal consequences. So suppose you're saying that we need to close schools because we are under the pandemic. There are other people who are able to access schools via online learning. So that means that the consequences of those ones who are able to access and those ones who are unable to access won't be the same. So these are some of the things that we are facing in South Africa. And I think it's something that other countries are facing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is my observation from my country. And I think it's similar. It's the same even in Brazil.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ritsani. So what I hear also from your contribution is the responsibility in that sense from the government, right? And the fact that I think that goes for a lot of countries. The government was actually not prepared for this type of pandemic and situation, and therefore it has actually amplified the inequality that has already been existing. And I also hear that in Brazil and Jamaica. And Ritsani, another follow-up question, because you highlighted a lot of similarities between South Africa, Brazil, and Jamaica. Are there also elements that are very specific to South Africa that you haven't heard from Shanari or Mateus?
Yes, I'm not sure how is the situation in Brazil. Whether the university where Matthias is based is like they're having their own way of dealing with the situation. But in South Africa, Department of Higher Education was coordinating the approach, the phasing approach, in terms of when the university should open, in terms of how many people, how many percentage. Because even the Minister of Higher Education, I think it's earlier or mid-April, he said that the universities must not start with online learning, because different universities were coming up with different approaches to say that, for instance, there are top universities in South Africa that are well resourced with funding. Other universities were able to send laptops to students that were in the rural areas to say that they need to go on with learning. But what the department or the Ministry of Education was trying to do was to make sure that people are having a sense of equality, to say that, no, we are not going to be left behind because we are based in the rural. Those ones who are based in the urban will be progressing with learning. So that is what the Minister of Education tried to do to coordinate the approach countrywide.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether it's the case in Brazil, whether universities where Matthias is based, they were coming up with their own solutions. So here in South Africa, higher education tried to, they even said that they are going to pay for the data of students countrywide. So they are saying that no one should be left behind, because regardless of whether this person is using financial aid scheme from the government, they must have access to internet and continue with learning.
So do I understand it right that indeed there is actually a state initiative to make
Yes.
sure that the students who weren't able to access online education were still able to receive education? So the one solution for online was actually just one alternative of a range of initiatives. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tanya. I think that's really insightful to hear that there are other solutions besides online, you know, in times of isolation. So thank you also for sharing that. And we've actually heard contributions that are also related to the context in the Global South. I'm very curious to hear what it's like in countries that are considered the Global North. Afua, maybe you would like to share what it's been like in the UK.
Of course. So in the UK, my university and in my role, it was really important to offer support to students. Obviously, it wasn't just the United Kingdom or Europe in this situation, it was a global pandemic, you know, and the whole world kind of came to a halt and no one knew what to do. And it was really important to highlight that there are certain demographics of students who would perhaps need more support than others. And this isn't just support in terms of, you know, just an email or a message. Students needed like emotional support, because for those who move home or those who decide to stay on campus, campus becomes a ghost town. There's nobody there around for them. I think someone mentioned earlier as well that, you know, these institutions, these universities become a new home and a safe space. And, you know, it's really important that they get this emotional support, not just emotional support, but access to resources and support with resources. So I think in general day-to-day higher education, people just seem to think, you know, all students have access to technology, they all have access to Wi-Fi, they all have access to, you know, financial support, and this isn't the case. And what this pandemic did actually is highlight these students who don't have access to laptops, other than the laptops the university would loan, for example, or they don't have access to stable internet. And when they go home, they may not, in some cases, might not even have a table to do their work on. And for some students, they would really struggle off the backhand of this pandemic compared to others. And it's really, really important that in a local sense, institutions realize that they hold a lot of power and it is their duty, because I think in a lot of contexts, there's only so much the government can do. And then the last one was especially around academic support. So, you know, some students are, well, students until now will be used to going in physically to seminars and lectures. And obviously this has completely changed when you move into dynamics of online learning. And for that is making sure that it's accessible, especially to international students. I think, and a lot of lecturers and academics are putting on what would have normally been lectures and seminars. They don't think of the time differences. But in actual fact, students who are across the world and international students would really struggle with having to get up in the dead of the night for lectures. Students who have, for example, accessibility needs would struggle having to stay engaged on the computer all day and staying engaged with video calling and stuff like that. And then one thing that my institution did was they introduced a no detriment policy, and it was really for no students to be disadvantaged by the pandemic, but it had different strands. So one of the strands was a safety net score, and that would basically be that your grade would not be any lower than what it had been up until the virus, and you could only excel from there, because it was really important, I think, for the institution that this cohort of students who are graduating this year aren't the disadvantaged students, and their degrees don't mean any less than students from years before. Another thing was also removal of medical evidence from the notification of extenuating circumstances. So if you couldn't sit an exam or do a piece of coursework for whatever reason, usually you'd have to submit medical evidence. And obviously in a global pandemic, hospitals and general practitioners aren't accessible. And also when you look at how the virus worked and the demographics of students and communities it affected, for example, it affected the BAME community disproportionately. And so it's really important that these students had something to fall back on, and that was various things. And you know, that's something I'd really encourage institutions to adopt, and quite a few institutions did pick this up in the UK, and then working with ECHO and University of Leiden and Utrecht in the Netherlands, they were also keen on implementing something similar, because especially for third years, they're now going out into the world of work, and there are a lot less jobs and there's a lot less money in the economy. And so you don't want this cohort of students to go out and be disadvantaged. And not just the cohort in general, but then these small demographics within them. So BAME students, for example. And then working with ECHO, Leiden and Utrecht, at Nottingham University, we'd already established a Black Leadership Programme. And in April, we were due to go on an international exchange. And this was, creating an international solidarity, offering opportunities of going abroad, studying and living abroad to these students. But unfortunately, due to the virus, they weren't able to travel. So what we did instead as partners is we created an online forum where the students had an opportunity to discuss what authentic representation looked like, what leadership should look like, and how to deal with crisis management, because nobody knew there was going to be a global pandemic, and nobody knew how much it was going to affect students all over the world. And so it was really, really important that these students have the opportunity to influence not only national policy, but international policy as well.
Great, thank you so much, Afua. So what I also hear from your contribution is actually how the institution became very mindful of bureaucracy, removing, all these obstacles that are based on paper, while the reality of the students actually demands much more flexibility. And then on part of the students, the idea of solidarity, connecting on an international level and see how you can empower and support each other. So that's really amazing to hear also from your perspective. What I'm also curious about is we've heard from Matthias, Ruzani, and Shinari also, the racialized dimension and how, Black students have also been affected. Obviously in the global north and the UK, there might be a different dynamic, I can imagine, for Black students. Can you also maybe reflect on that and how Black Lives Matter has impacted that conversation maybe?
Of course, I think in the global north, there was always a lot of recognition about the disparities between BAME students and Black students. And I think almost a lot of institutions and bodies in society were very guilty of treating BAME as a homogenous group. And so they never looked within this group to see that actually a lot more inequalities existed.
Sorry, Afua, just for those who are not familiar with BAME, can you explain what that means?
Of course, so BAME stands for Black and Minority Ethnicity Groups. And some people use BAME and some people use BME, and one's more inclusive, but people prefer terms differently. And I think, it's always really, really important to ask. But institutions have been very aware. So for example, in the United Kingdom, as a BAME student, you are less likely to achieve a first class or a second upper class degree compared to your counterparts. And this is because of various things like a lack of sense of belonging, a lack of representation within the academic body, a lack of representation in the curriculum. And it's due to so many different things. But I feel like what the Black Lives Matter movement did, and the acceleration of it, because Black Lives Matter movement has always existed, is it started to make it an issue, make race equality, inequality even, an issue for everybody, not just the BAME community. And that puts more of the onus on the institution, rather than the BAME students and the Black students who have to suffer off the back of it. And I feel like the first important step for institutions and organizations was to stand in solidarity, because showing that support shows a sense of belonging and shows a sense of mattering. And then after that, it's for them to be proactive in change. And like people always talk about like diversity, and diversity comes from the people. You then need to be inclusive and you need to be progressive to match that as an organization or as an institution.
Great, thank you so much, Afua. And indeed, I also recognize that from the Netherlands, when we talk about inequality, oftentimes there's this idea of individual students coming from individual backgrounds. And the idea is, you look at the people, the individuals, rather than how a system affects individuals. And I recognize your reflection that Black Lives Matter has really put forth the idea of institutionalized racism and exclusion, and how that has also been amplified by COVID. and the need for the institution to respond rather than individual or professionals. So thank you, Afua, also for that reflection. Finally, I want to go to Maribel also, because the George Floyd murder has come from your context. So I'm also curious to hear your reflections on what you've heard from your colleagues from across the globe, and obviously also what the past few months have been like for you in terms of COVID and Black Lives Matter. Maribel.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of similarities actually across the board, which is like unique. I like that I got to sit back and listen first to everyone across the country. We have implemented some of the same things in our university with grading scales, having the option of choosing whether we wanted to have a class be credit, earned for credit, or for the grade. So that was a good academic support and change of support. But that, I mean, alone wasn't made just from scratch from the administrators coming up with that solution. It was made with the student advocates who, were pushing forth for those types of flexible grading systems, right? Because even at that point, we didn't know how our classes would pan out since, and a lot of different majors aren't virtual learning is not applicable to them. I had a lot of friends in like fine arts who say like, how am I supposed to dance in front of a screen or learn the dance in front of a screen if you're a dance major? And it was, I mean, across the board different for everyone. So having those options in terms of academics was nice. We also had students who had to leave their dorms with little notice and had to move away. And then the housing here had to figure out who had an exception, because there are people who cannot go back to their homes, whether they're an international student or they have their problems at their home, whether it's too far away. Maybe they were from New York where the virus kind of hit the worst in the beginning, and how do you send someone back to a hotspot of COVID and essentially have them have to adapt to their environment. And then personally in my own life, I had to deal a lot with having to really act as this translator, interpreter, support, teacher to my parents, like being, as mentioned, Mexican-American. My parents don't speak any English. They both are essential workers. So it was really, really hard. It still is hard to see them have to go to work no matter what, right? Even when they were sick, some of the rules and implementing different cleaning and sanitary rules, regulations, that wasn't added until people got sick, until people infected other people at work. And it was so scary to think that I could lose my mom and dad, them being older, them being more prone to different health diseases, diabetes, cholesterol, all of those things, and having lack of healthcare or shortage of healthcare even at that. It was really scary, and it was a lot to deal with on top of school, on top of my work, my organizations, and losing work, because I do work on campus, and I lost both kind of jobs for quite a while and had to rely on funding, savings accounts, and different things that I had to do. Luckily, the school did offer a COVID relief fund, so we got to apply, and I actually did thankfully have access to a few more $100 there, so that kind of covered my rent and my bills for a month. But it's hard to even catch up now. I'm working back on campus, and I don't have 40 hours like I did before in the previous summer. I have less than half. And it's hard to catch up, and it's even hard when we add on now that this huge racial disparity came upon us, and that so many of our white counterparts are now finally realizing what we all in every minority context have had to deal with, and they're barely connecting the dots that this problem has been there, and that caused so many people to die, to be hurt, and to all of these different, to have these different repercussions, and having to narrate conversations with people when you see on social media that they, you know, people you thought were your friends or you thought were your allies, and they actually didn't understand, and they misinterpreted the conversation, or they made the conversation about themselves. That's all been hard. Even myself, as someone who's not Black, you know, having to support and rely on my friends to help educate me, or to help me find resources to educate myself on Black matters, and also having again to translate to my parents. And my parents are super old generation Mexican, coming from poverty, impoverished areas where there are no Black people, so having to explain to them even my own relationships with my Black peers and colleagues in my university, and having to teach them, you know, what is going on, and help them kind of reverse what their train of thought was when they were brought upon, when they were brought up in Mexico. So it's been a lot. And in that time, I also want to say though, there's a lot of paradox, like there's a lot of missing pieces in my life, but then it brought more time for me to reflect, to grow. I think that's also really important. I don't want to make it all negative, because it is a negative kind of positive. I've, been able to read more, which I love. I found a love to do, and reading in those different specific things that have been going on, anti-Black readings, or learning more about just supporting one another in different ways, and how we can do that, incorporating it in education and everything in between.
Thank you so much, Maribel, also for that extensive and layered reflection. I hear so many dimensions, aside from the educational experience and the ideas that came up, such as a relief fund, so like a financial support, right, for students who deal with that, but also the family dynamics, you know, your concerns and your worries for your family at home, having to go to situations where they are at risk. But also the conversations you've had, not being non-Black, but being a person of color, and navigating that conversation, and then the dimension of educating people on those matters is very exhausting, I can imagine, also mentally. So I'm also very happy to hear that you also touch on how it has also allowed you to reflect and to take that time, especially when you have to self-isolate. You're kind of forced to, turn inwards and see how you're dealing with this. And it's good to know that you've also found time to do that. So thank you also, Maribel, for that reflection. I see some questions popping up in the Q&A box, and it's actually now also time to head to questions from the audience. So I invite the audience to share your questions in the Q&A box, and we have about, I think, 20 to 25 minutes, so I'll do my best to address them within the time. I already see 2 questions regarding Afwa's experience with BAME. So someone asked, can you type out the acronym? So if I'm not mistaken, Afwa, it's BAME, right?
Yeah, so it's BEME, which will stand for Black and Asian Minority Ethnicities. But some people in the UK and in the EU also use BME, which just stands for Black and Minority Ethnicities, which is supposed to be basically inclusive of all demographics who aren't white. But some people find BAME, some people find BME exclusionary because it doesn't directly mention Asian, but it is inclusive of that. But people prefer using different terms. It's always best to ask. It's the same way some people like Black, and some people don't like Black, and some people use Black politically. So it varies within the UK and Europe.
Thank you, Alpha, for that explanation. I hope that also answers the questions. And again, if you have questions, please share them in the Q&A box. And if I don't see any questions, obviously I have much more to ask, so I'll head on with a follow-up question from my end. So thank you again all for these really insightful reflections. I've heard so much in terms of similarities in challenges, And I can imagine that, for instance, in the global north, this idea that it's, everyone has access and everyone is equal, also kind of leads to the idea that there are no issues and that COVID has really kind of exposed those challenges. I would also like to hear from you how, what has been going on in the streets in terms of protest or the social debate has impacted the conversation within your institutions. Because speaking from the Dutch context, there is this idea that what happens within the institution sometimes seems, disconnected or isolated from what's going on out there. So people protesting on the streets, it doesn't really affect us. And I think Black Lives Matter has really shown that that is not the case. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that and how, what's going on outside of the institution has impacted what's happening within the institution. Is there anyone who wants to respond to that? And I'll leave it up to you to respond. And otherwise, I'll just ask you what. Matthias, would you like to respond?
Yes, of course. What we saw in Brazil about all the Black Lives Matter movement, it was really intense in terms of social media, but actually I believe it brought not that much impact in real life. So it's really cool to post Black Lives Matter in your social medias and show that you're supporting the movement, but real actions and transformations are still hard to see. And I mean, like in about behavior, like the situations about racism and inequalities are still happening in the country. And again, it's cool, but I can't see that much change in behavior after, I don't know, 1 month after everything. It seems to be all back to normal. And normal is not good, just to be clear.
Yeah. So basically, it's almost like a hype. If I understand you, you put something on social media, it's trendy now, but when it comes to actual change and action, there's not much different.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Do the others recognize that? I see Shanari nodding and and Rutsani. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. What the movement has done to South Africa in particular, it didn't just bring the hype on social media, but it led to the conversation on the streets. People are talking. And then recently there is a former cricket player, international cricket player, who came out to say that he is coming out to raise some issues of racism that was happening in the national cricket team that he experienced during his time of playing for South African cricket team. So he was saying that he's saying it because he was influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. So many people are starting to speak out about the injustice and oppression that they've experienced. So people are talking. And then this took me back, when I was watching the video, it took me back to what Afua said during our introductory meeting about the issue of Black Lives Matter. It's not only about access to opportunity or equality. It's all about a sense of belonging and a sense of mattering. And then from the conversation of Makayantini, the cricket player, you could feel that during his time when he was reflecting, you could see that his life as a cricketer during his time of play didn't matter at all. He didn't feel a sense of belonging during his time because he was sharing the experiences about how he has isolated himself from other players who were white. So this is the conversation. And for him to speak out like that, it also triggered other people to come out to carry the conversation forward. So this is what's happening in our country. People are talking. But when you go to universities, it's a matter of access. You know, if you come from a previously disadvantaged group, you won't have equal access compared to your privileged counterpart, which majority are white. So when they say that you want to make sure that everybody is learning, they are also thinking about Black students. They are having Black students in mind to say that when we move with learning, we must also push the Black students forward.
Yeah, thank you, Rutani. I think that's actually a great point that I also recognize here in the Netherlands, is that Black Lives Matter has actually empowered people who might have been silent before Black Lives Matter, but have experienced, you know, those the impact of racism, to speak up, speak out, and then also push forth the agenda of, you know, equity and access and inclusion. So I think that's a great point. Shinari, I also saw you nodding. Do you also want to respond?
Sure. I'm saying that similar to what Matthias sort of spoke about in Brazil in terms of the social media hype surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement, it also exposed the system in some way and society, not just higher education institutions, but society on a whole. Because even in Jamaica, many, you know, voices were heard in terms of, for example, many roads, streets names that we had that were coming from a racial past, and that was brought to the fore. So many people began to talk about these things, and similar to what my South African colleague spoke about is the fact that sports athletes and sports professionals in general would have spoken about the, you know, suffering that they had to go through, whether in the past or even now, but it really empowered people to begin to talk about the issues and how the system over time, you know, has stifled them, you know, and, you know, has exposed now how the system has worked. And importantly to Pravini, one of the most important things that happened in the past couple of months in terms of what's happening in the climate, the social climate, the health climate, is the fact that there are inequalities and there is a social divide, because in my context, the Caribbean context, Jamaica context, we have people who are of a social class as against those. So we have middle, we have low income, and we have high income families. And even during the pandemic, this was shown, whereby the higher strata of society, those existing in those classes, didn't understand what people from the lower class were experiencing. So even when we had the many curfews, many people from the lower income strata were saying that they cannot, you know, stay inside because they don't have the necessary resources to help them while they're inside. And those from the upper strata didn't understand what they meant. So there's two divide in terms of how we look at our context in Jamaica and the Caribbean. And also academics. Many academics have families too. And what brought about during the pandemic was the fact that they had to juggle being academics, full-time mothers, having their own families as well. And this would have affected sometimes how, you know, teaching and learning would have taken place. And it is important that going forward, I always hear Dr. Saren Stewart, one of my mentors, who spoke about the fact that we have to have critical pedagogies. And now when higher education is working in, or we're working in education in emergencies, we have to ensure that our teaching and learning does not suppress our voices, but there's access to all, equity and diversity in how we transcend and want to transform the space.
Thank you, Shinari, also for that contribution. And indeed, I think Maribel really highlighted, you know, the student perspective and maybe also the children's perspective in relation to parents, but you also addressed the other way around, obviously, how parenting students or indeed academics are also, you know, juggling everything at home, having to take care of your family. And what I also found interesting from your reflection is, you know, the actual physical space of the colonial legacy, right? So we've also seen that in the European context, where students challenge not only the space in terms of, you know, where they belong, the safe space, but the actual physical space, the names, the statues, and how that is also part of an institutionalized context in relation to colonial legacy and racism. So thank you also for addressing that. Afua, what are your reflections in regards to this topic?
So I feel like I'm in a slightly different position, but I also recognize that the position of Nottingham Trent University is different from other institutions. So I'd say before the acceleration of the movement, our university is very progressive, and they use data and they use student voice to change pedagogy and to try and improve things like attainment and these disparities. But no university is perfect. So off the back of the acceleration of the movement, what we actually had was an increase in reports of racism. And these just weren't like brand new cases of racism, they were historic cases. And I think someone mentioned before about off the back of the movement, people felt more confident in using their voices, and even using your voice as an act of resistance itself. And what this did, like with the use of social media within the institution, is it encouraged people to start to have these like very uncomfortable conversations, which I think they needed, because conversations around race and culture aren't normalized. They're seen as, you know, something people tend to avoid, something people don't want to have. And these highlighted the problems that existed within institutions. So racism, the lack of representation both within the body of staff and within the curriculum. And when you look at all these factors, they are institutionalized. They're not just factors that exist and just have suddenly appeared. They have been there and they're very historic. And what NTU have been doing is they pledged towards the Race Equality Charter, which is a charter within higher education that basically states that you are working towards race equality and equity within your institution. So today, our self-assessment team, which has, I think the membership is around 60% BAME or BME, so it's the most diverse committee at the institution, and they've started to look at 12 action points that they can work towards in the next 6 to 12 months, and then the next 3 years towards the charter. But it's really important that, you know, the universities are showing solidarity, and we're now, with the acceleration of the movement, it's not only a problem for these diverse students, this demographic, it's a problem for everyone. So this has either been divisive in people standing against the movement, or it's been inclusive in people saying we are standing with you. And I think that's really, really important. And starting to make this problem of inequality and inequity a problem for everyone, not just a problem for one community.
Yeah, that's great, Alfred, to really normalize, right, the conversation, and then also show this institutional commitment towards actual inclusion. I just want to check with Terrence also, because I believe Maribel isn't in the call anymore. I think her screen I saw froze up. I just want to make sure that she indeed is not here, just in case, because I wanted to ask her.
Yeah, I'm not seeing her on either.
Okay, so I hope that she will rejoin us, but then I know that that she's not here for now to contribute to this specific topic. So we have a few minutes left, and we have some questions in the Q&A box. And actually, I want to conclude with that. And I see Maribel has joined us again. Welcome back, Maribel.
Sorry,
I was just checking. Yeah, I was just checking. But you're back, so good to see you.
Yeah, sorry, my computer froze.
No problem, no problem. So we have a few minutes left before we have to wrap up, but I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to the topic if you want to, in relation to, you know, how the conversations outside of the institution have affected the conversation within the institution.
Yeah, so I feel like we're at a pivotal point in my institution, as well as just in my city, in the county, as well as the state and the country as in a whole, where we're in this interesting point where we're seeing some statements, we're seeing some what I consider some social media hype, right? And also maybe even some task forces, some events. I'm not seeing policy. Maybe that's on my part. Maybe I haven't searched deep enough. I haven't, you know, had the time to really dive into what are the policies that are being implemented in terms of our institution, in terms of the city of Wichita and the state of Kansas, etc. Although I do see it in some other states, you know, being in the United States, every state is different. Every state has their own governor and the way that they lead. And then political parties are different among states as well. So all of that looks different. But we do have the creation of a Black Student Experience Task Force at my university. So the Student Government Association has put forth that effort in order and to hear students, Black students in particular, their experience and kind of hear from them firsthand as to what they are needing, what they are lacking in terms of higher education and specifically in Wichita State. But even at that, we don't know what the progress has been. I'm not in the committee. I do know that I have friends that are a part of the committee, and I'm eager to see the work that they do. I hope that they do not put the work solely on the Black students. I don't think that is going to be effective in any way. And a lot of times we see that. I work at the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and a lot of times all of our staff members being of color, we are left with that burden to do all the work. So it's interesting. I feel like there are ways that our university is working towards bettering, and there are ways that maybe it's just kind of putting a band-aid on what is really happening instead of, you know, really searching and aiming at the root cause of some of these issues in terms of higher education and all of the facets that are included. So it'll be interesting to see. It's my last year, so I also want to devote some time to see what kind of impacts I can do and what I can leave. Although in this movement in general, you need more than one person, and you need more than one group of people. So we cannot just lean on the Black students here. We cannot just lean on one student advocate or one student leader. We have to be able to ignite change across the board and go to those different factions that are overlooked, or are often ignored, or are often maybe even purposely like skipped just because we don't want to face on hard conversations and really, you know, dig at some realizations that some people have yet to come to. So I'm both excited, scared, and I don't know, you feel a bunch of different emotions when you're in this spot of what's next, you know?
Yeah. No, thank you, Maribel. And I think you raised some excellent points by addressing the policy aspect, right? So statements are good, empowering people is good, but for sustainable impact, you need policy, right? To really make sure that it's institutionalized. And also, you know, the question of the burden and the responsibility and making sure that it's a collective effort rather than individual efforts. And even for those who are not actually always or not, you know, in a position of power to actually make those changes, and really also speak to those who are in positions of power to take on that responsibility. So thank you also for that contribution. So we actually have to wrap up the discussion, and we've had some questions in the Q&A box, and what I actually want to do is to summarize briefly the questions that have been posed, and then I'll give you all an opportunity to share some concluding remarks, and I'll leave it up to you which topic you want to address. So I hope that in that sense we can also cater to the questions that have been posed, and that we can offer from your point of view the reflections. So what I see in the Q&A box is actually one question relating to, or one dimension related to the new normal, right? So if we, and obviously we hope that we overcome COVID, but as Mateus has mentioned, the normal was never good. So what does that new normal look like, and what are your hopes for the new normal? And are there lessons learned from the experiences that we've already heard from you, you know, going beyond the call of duty, reaching out to corporate stakeholders, you know, the state's responsibility to make sure that no one is left behind, removing bureaucracy. We've heard so many dimensions that you addressed. So what does that new normal look like? That can be on a policy level, on an institutional level, but certainly also maybe on a more practical level, you know, for teaching staff, for those who are in direct contact with students. And then finally, there's a question also related to mental health. So what can you share about, self-care and maybe also things that you've done? I know Maribel also briefly touched on that. So if I can ask you to briefly respond to a topic that you want to address, and I'll start with Shinari with your final concluding remark for today.
Thank you so much, Pravini. So going forward, well, operating in the new normal, it is important that we change our curriculums, especially at my institution. I know that's going to be a big part of the discussion and the policies going forward. I believe that we need to have diverse and all-encompassing curriculums that deal with the diverse range of students that we have within the space. And also, again, going back on the one size fits all approach will definitely not work. Curriculums, course designs, evaluations, assessments, not just of students, but academics, should be inclusive. And in that regard, I mentioned the colonial teachings that we would still have permeating within our curriculums will need to change and represent, the global perspectives of our students, academics, leaders, and the entire higher education space, as well as, of all our stakeholders going forward. My institution have been doing some work on that, and I think going forward, that's going to be critical, especially because online learning is going to be, more used now in higher education. It is also important that as part of the discussion, students' voices are heard. Too many times in higher education, student decisions are made and students are not a part of the decision. And student leaders will have to be important going forward. Students will also have to be flexible, and higher education administrators also need to be flexible in how they approach the new normal, because these decisions will be critical to students and their well-being. It is important to also remember that students have options and they will decide what is important to them as well. And going forward, I think the two of the most important things that will need to happen is while we conversate, it is important that these policies are put in place to reflect our space as well as the global space. And while I touch on the new normal, I must talk about the self-care, because we also need to reflect on our personal lives, and are our thoughts representative of what should happen in the professional sphere of how we teach and interact. And access diversity and equity is important to our personal lives as well, because what's important and how we conversate in our personal lives will impact what we do in our professional lives as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinari. So I actually hear a call for decolonizing the curriculum, right? And the university. So
For sure.
yeah, and also being flexible and critically reflect on how your personal framework of reference impacts your professional conduct. So thank you, Shinari, for that concluding remark. Afua, what's your concluding remark for today?
So I think one thing that we can take out today, and like what discussions we've had around the world and higher education, is that normal practice was very disproportionate. And so the new normal should be inclusive and it needs to be diverse. And this can be done, I think, on all levels through things like equality impact. So when redesigning what teaching and learning should look like, are people taking into account the protected characteristics? So the age of students, the diversity of students, the ability students and stuff like that, and starting to think, actually, is what we are designing, what we're creating, accessible to all kinds of students. I think that's really, really important. I think it's also really important to use student voice to co-create change, not just change as in physical change, but change in pedagogy, change in the way we act and the way we live. Because when you're creating these things, it's almost as if students are the consumers of higher education. And so why not use them to be part of that change? And then to see real change, you need time, because change should be for the long term, not for the short term. You need resources, and sometimes resources is money, but the money is there. Universities have money. And the last thing you need is buy-in from senior leadership, because that's where the real change can happen. It's not fair on people to be crusaders of change and have to fight inequality by themselves. That can come from senior leadership and making it a problem for everyone, because these problems are institutional and they lead the institution. And thank you for having me today as well.
Thank you so much, Afua, also for that clear overview. I think it's very concrete, so thank you for that. Matthias, your final remark for today?
Okay, that's great. I totally agree with Alpha, and I wanna just to share that transformations are important. We have policies to be changed, but any change come from people. So we need to prepare people to take roles, important roles to make the change. So my call to action in this case is first connect yourselves, not just Black people, but all the people interested in make this change. And secondly, finance talents, prepare people to take the role, to take positions that involves decision making. So just one short example, we have endowment funds. I am one of the responsibles for creating the first endowment fund at my university, and we also have the chance to do the same for example, Black people. Like we can connect Black people in order to form new talents to take the role to make the transformations in the future. So that's why that's how I believe we can leverage great changes.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I think that's a great point. It's all about people. The movement is led by people, and you need to invest in those people to be able to empower them and also enable them, right, to make those contributions. Thank you, Maribel. Final remark for today.
Wow, I mean, everyone's put together and some, right?
Comprehensive.
That was good. Everybody's takes are wonderful, and they apply globally, which we are kind of learning here in this webinar. So reiterating policy, let's set out, hate crime, having those written on our laws, having guidelines, being proactive, having measures and procedures that prepare us for all of these different things that have been happening, but yet there is no concrete way to hold people accountable for their actions, for their statements, for their free speech, all of that, having to outline what those things look like, define racism in classrooms, in conversations with your friend. And I think ultimately just thinking of access everywhere with food, with healthcare, with finances, everything providing, of course, more money. Like Afua said, universities have money. They have people that they know that have money. Let's help, our students financially, because a lot of that burden that we fundamentally feel is from the lack of resources, the lack of money that we have as students, whether we're first generation students at college or low income students at college. Funding those resources on campus, giving them more flexibility and again, financial resources to be able to serve those students that they're supposed to be serving. A lot of times offices are not given the adequate budget to be able to support their students or underrepresented students. And on top of all of that, in terms of self-care, creating an environment and culture among your friends, among your workspace, and everywhere you communicate with people, that there has to be a level of empathy when we talk about these issues, where let's limit shaming and canceling. Let's try to really help project people forward to this mindset where you can have learned something and unlearn it, and have someone help you with that process, and show grace while we do all that, because there's so much that we know and there's so much that we don't know. And we have to be able to be change agents at our campus and start with us and continue to hopefully just, forward that movement onward. So thank you again, Pravani, and everyone said for having me. I learned so much, so thank you.
Thank you, Maribel. Also, I really hear a holistic approach in your contribution, right? It's not just about the educational aspect, it's also about everything around surrounding it, the infrastructure, and indeed allowing everyone to learn and to unlearn. And then finally, Ritsani, your final remark for today?
Thank you, Praveen. Going back to the new normal, I think will require a lot of policy debate and political will, because if the new normal will learn online, that means that they will need resources, they will need access to internet. And since the COVID-19 has presented the challenge of access to that, that means that going to the new normal, we need to address such challenges that the pandemic has presented. So I think that requires a lot of political will and policymakers debating and coming up with solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rutsani, also for emphasizing the importance of the policy aspect. So with 1 minute to go, I'm so sorry, Catherine, I know you wanted some more time, but I hope that's enough to wrap up. The final question that came up in the Q&A box, if you are able to share the slides. So I'm gonna give it back to you with that question, and thank you again for hosting this amazing session. Back to you, Catherine. Your mic is still turned off, Catherine, so I want to make sure that we're able to hear you.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you, Pravini. And thank you to everyone. So let me just say again, I really want to thank Pravini for being our moderator. She did an amazing job and kind of kept the whole conversation going. I really want to thank our expert panelists, Mateus, Shanari, Ruzani, Mirabel, and Afua. I just think you are grace and intelligence and thinking on the spot, just perfect for us for our kickoff webinar. So we really want to thank you. I also want to thank the organizations that co-hosted with us, ECHO in the Netherlands and the Council for Opportunity in Education. I want to thank my GAPS fellow executive committees, Eva Egronpola with IAU, Maureen Hoyler with the Council for Opportunity in Education, and Mary Tupanweno at ECHO, who did really an amazing job in having this webinar come together. She has been incredible. And I want to thank you, our participants, for staying with us, being active in the chat, and just also, I hope, seeing where this work applies to your everyday lives. Next slide, please. So we have a new website and we are working on it, so I hope that you will go visit it. I will say that we have a campaign that I think many of you might be interested in participating. It's called the YGAPS campaign, and we also have opportunities for think pieces. So we will ask you to visit, we will be in touch with you, and we will move forward with our work. Next slide, please. And then finally, I would ask everyone to mark their calendar for Tuesday, September 29th, where we will continue the conversation. And this time we will ask a global panel of educators and staff to consider many of the same issues that we just heard on the panel today. What does it mean to think about a new normal when the old normal wasn't what we wanted? What are the educators and staff thinking about for the COVID situation? And then again, we always have been thinking about what does it mean to help all students get to, through, and beyond their education. And I think many of our panelists today talked about the fact that we really need to be thinking about policies and programming that reflect the variety of students who are in our space. So again, thank you very much for joining us today on the GAPS first webinar. Thank you to the panelists, and I hope you all stay healthy and safe. Good afternoon. Bye.
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 Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye,
Take
thank
care
you.
as well.
Everyone. Bye. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. You were great.
You were terrific.
Thank you, Mary.